Hi there, I'm Logan Medish, your host, and my guest today has written a book to help dispel some of the myths around what most people consider to be the odd, spring-powered British bazooka, the Piat. Today's guest on the High Caliber History podcast is Matthew Moss, a historian, researcher, and author from the United Kingdom, who is also the co-host of the Fighting on Film podcast, which looks at war movies and conflict on film. Matthew, welcome to the High Caliber History podcast.
Hi, Logan. Thanks for having me on. This is great.
Absolutely. Glad you could make it. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I know we can do it because you are a man of many talents and you are pulled in so many different directions. We're gonna talk about research and books and documentaries and all sorts of stuff that you got going on. So first, let's start with a little bit of your background projects that you've been working on. You've got Historical Firearms website that you run. You're also involved with the Armourer's bench doing videos. So tell us a little bit about those two projects and how they blend together and where they diverge.
Sure. Well, I started Historical Firearms back in 2013. And that was basically a sort of a hobby, really. I'd just done my my undergraduate degree in history, and I was working a normal job in an office, and I was kind of bored, and I thought, well, I want to keep my hand in. I want to carry on doing research, but I want it to be fun. I'm specifically interested in firearms and small arms history, so I thought, well, I'll do a history blog, and I'll do one on historic firearms. So that's how the blog was born. And then over the years, I just kept, writing articles on there and doing research and, having the chance to go to various museums and collections. And I sort of slipped into writing more and more on the blog. And I thought, well, you know what, I'm gonna call time on doing the day job, the office job, and I'm going to go back to university. I'm going to do my master's. So I went back and did my master's, and I did my master's in military history. So I specialized, and I wrote my master's on the EM2, the British bullpup rifle from the 50s.
Yep. And
I probably wouldn't have chosen that, without having become fascinated by these things through the blog itself. Okay. So from there, I kept on writing for the blog, and then at that point, I was asked by a couple of editors at magazines in the UK to do some articles about small arms and that kind of thing. So History of War, the Armourer, Classic Arms, Militaria magazines, and then I wrote something for Small Arms Review, which was like a watermark for me. Like, that's a big thing,
Right.
Small Arms Review is one of these magazines that we all read, even in the UK. I'm very familiar with it. And it's not on newsstands here. So that was a big moment. And I thought, well, let's keep trying to make a career out of this. Let's try and do this properly. So I was working other jobs at the same time after I'd done my master's, and eventually I sort of like slipped into the role of a full-time researcher historian. And a couple of years ago, as you mentioned, I launched the Armourer's Bench with my friend Vic Tuff, who is an armourer by trade and an engineer. And we decided, well, there's a gap for doing videos that are perhaps a little bit more in depth. And I wanted to bring my academic side to the table and write additional articles alongside what we were doing in the video. So we do a video, we show the workings of the weapon, how it comes apart. But then we try and include the development history, operational history, that kind of thing. And, when I'm doing all this research, it might as well be an article next to the video as well. So
Right.
That's one of the things that I always try and do is give an in-depth article with all the source material that I've used listed as in a bibliography. So it's a proper article, not 100% academic in style, so it's accessible.
Sure.
But I like to be thorough and explain to people how these firearms that we're looking at worked. So we've looked at all sorts of things from the G11 down to a Derzeg, breech loading carbine. So we've looked at Anna Ferguson, in fact, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, because I know that a couple of your other guests have really talked about Patrick Ferguson and his amazing breech loader.
Yeah, I almost feel like I should change the name of the podcast to the Patrick Ferguson podcast, featuring other historic stuff. You know,
I was talking to Miles after I listened to your episode with Miles Vining, and I said, I think I'm going to mess with Logan a bit, and I'm going to choose Patrick Ferguson as well. So everyone that comes on, it's Patrick Ferguson.
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, and as I mentioned in the other episodes, he really doesn't get his due.
No, that's true.
His name is just not as well known as it should be.
Really, honestly, having had the chance to handle one of the rifles about a year or so ago, it's amazing engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as Miles and Jonathan said previously, it's not only that this amazing piece of engineering was developed and actually fielded, it's that Ferguson was actually pushing the idea of light infantry. That's very interesting, I think.
Absolutely. Now, where did you handle the original at?
The original, I don't believe it was one of the ones that was deployed to America with Ferguson's Rifle Corps. It was a military pattern rifle.
Okay. So
it appears to have been an example that had been built possibly after. It wasn't dated, and the provenance was good, but didn't have solid dates. And that was in a military collection here in the UK.
Okay, in a private collection over there.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, I've handled a reproduction, but I've never had the opportunity to handle an original. It's on the bucket list, and one day.
It's one of those like real honors. Like every time I go to a collection, I'm always inquire of what kind of firearms they have, and have you got a Ferguson is normally a question that is asked.
Right.
And I remember years ago when I first met Jonathan Ferguson at Leeds, I said, does the museum have a Ferguson rifle? And he was like, yes, but it's on display. And I was like, So I had to wait a few more years, but I finally found a collection where they had an example, and it had recently been repaired because it had taken a little bit of stock damage, because, as you know, they're quite fragile in the stock.
Yeah.
The mortise is really narrow in places. It's surprising, but they're very elegant rifles, and it blows my mind to think that they were thinking in the 1770s. Let's field a breech loader that can fire numerous rounds a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Aimed from cover. It's next level jump ahead in terms of the tactics of the time.
Absolutely. I mean, and there was so much of that going on. I don't really think we give the inventors their due in that time frame, with what they were experimenting with. And it's and I talked about this with Miles, it's easy to understand what worked and what succeeded. But, because you look at the design, you go, well, yeah, of course that worked because they did X, Y, and Z and it all fell into place. But that's the beauty of hindsight. They're looking at it and they don't know what's going to work and they don't know what's going to fail unless they try,
Well, exactly. And there are so many other breech loading designs from that period that, it's something they were giving serious thought to. And the numerous methods of breech loading came about. So, there's the Crespi system from Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a number of French screw breech, like Ferguson's rifle, designs that come from around the 1720s onwards. So it's something they were, even 50 years before Ferguson got to the point of having a rifle that was, fieldable and, could be issued to troops. They were, they've been thinking about that for 40 years.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's the same concept. Like, look at the revolver. I mean, Sam Colt gets the credit, with coming up with the design in the 1830s, and then the practicality of it, a couple decades later. But you look early on at stuff like the Collier, which I just think is such a cool piece. I had the opportunity to actually take one of those apart, down to all the little pieces, and pull them out and check out how it all goes together. And that's such a cool design. But you figure that's half a century before Sam Colt's working on his stuff. And again, it's one of those things you don't know what's going to take off and what's not until you try,
I mean, this is one of the most fascinating parts of firearms and small arms history. Like, we all know about the big successes, but often, the things that led to those successes and the things that have sort of become dead ends are often the most fascinating, and I've definitely found that with some of the projects that I've worked on, that things that work but aren't practical,
right?
Sometimes don't even work at all, are just as interesting as the designs that we all know and recognize now that have become so iconic in the last century.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about different projects that you've been involved with, let's talk about one that's forthcoming, the Rhineland 45 documentary project that you're going to be part of. And that's through Real Time History, the folks that put together the Great War series on YouTube. That was just a fantastic series following World War I there, and they're still doing great stuff. I really enjoyed their 16 Days in Berlin that they put out before this. And
really ambitious.
Yes, very ambitious. And they did a great job with that. If there's anyone listening who hasn't seen it, there will be a link to that. You really need to check that out.
Yeah, it's definitely worth watching. It's it's probably the most in-depth documentary about the Battle and Fall of Berlin that's out there now. It's definitely well worth a watch, and their production values are always so good.
Yes.
And their meticulous research is always, you don't get that everywhere you look, and that's something I really, really appreciate with those guys, and Jesse and Flo. I was really honored when they asked whether I'd be interested in helping out with sort of like the weapons and kit side of things.
Right.
Just to give some kind of personal perspective on what soldiers were using in the field during the operations to cross the Rhine and push into Germany in early 1945, because it's a bit of a forgotten campaign in a lot of respects. Mm-hmm. It's a battle that was important but is overshadowed by the actual fall of Berlin and the operations in the east. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to working on that with them. I've already begun the preliminary research into finding some, juicy personal accounts of small arms use, and, finding about just what weapons were used in the actual campaign itself. But that I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully that'll be into production early next year, and then we can get that out and everyone can get an idea of this campaign that's really sort of become a little bit obscure compared to everything else that was going on, not only in the East but also in the Far East at that time. Sure.
Yeah, it's you mentioned their production value and it's fantastic. I mean, the amount of support that it got through the Indiegogo and the Kickstarter, and same with the 16 Days to Berlin. It's proof positive that people are sick of the Pawn Stars crap that's on History Channel, and that people want to see actual
real history,
real researched history that's properly documented with people who know what they're talking about. They aren't just talking heads. It's not always aliens. Sometimes it's aliens. It's not always aliens.
At least 60% of everything is aliens.
That's going to be the
at least according to the History Channel documentaries that I've been watching. So
yeah, absolutely, it's always aliens, and whatever you bring in is only worth best I can do is like $25. So
yeah, and you've always got to get a friend to look at it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, there's a definite thirst for actual real documentary programs about important history.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and history's history. It's so fascinating. Like, there's so many topics you could cover. So many that deserve much more in-depth coverage than they get. But, you know, at least there's people out there that are trying to deliver these things, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, there's so much going on. And that's one thing I really got to give credit to you guys over there in Europe. It's so much of the stuff, the proper stuff today that's being done is coming out of Europe. You know, there, for whatever reason, production companies and the networks over here aren't picking up stuff like that. I mean, it's all the reality TV junk that's gaining the views over here, but there are a number of different publications and production companies all throughout Europe that are just producing top-notch documentaries, you know, and not all World War II focused, you know. I mean, they're covering other time periods. That's great. And, you know, some of it I can pick up through like the Roku streaming and stuff. And so I'm able to tune into some of those shows that, thank God for streaming, because otherwise I'd be stuck watching Aliens and Pawn Stars and, you know. So
yeah, I mean, I hope it's a trend that changes. I really do.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the very first shows that I watched that probably really set me on the path was Tales of the Gun.
I knew that's what you were going to say.
I know. Everyone says this. And everyone I talk to is sort of like, yeah, Tales of the Gun, man. And, but it was a great show. And, you know, for any of its failings and, you know, anything it didn't go into depth, compare it to anything that's out there today that's being made by a major network, it's head and shoulders above it, really is.
Yep.
I mean, 2 episodes on the, you know, the guns of Browning, yes please. You know, come on.
Exactly.
I mean, you know, obscure stuff, niche episodes about like self-defense weapons, that kind of thing. It was like really, really interesting.
Yeah.
But we just don't get that sort of attention to detail and depth anymore, I guess, in TV. But and there at least we have the internet and we can make our own.
Yes, exactly. And that Tales of the Gun was, you know, you talk about a large undertaking and remarkable production value for the time. You know, it was great. I mean, it had tons of fantastic people in there, and people that, you know, little did I know, and I'm sure little did you know, that you'd end up meeting some of these people and working with these people, and you know, you know, I know we've both spent time, you know, with Phil Schreier and Gary James and Phil Spangenberger and all sorts of folks, people that I saw on TV for the longest time. And
I know, right? It's kind of surreal when you meet people that you've watched in these programs that you've held up for so long as being like great pieces of, you know, documentary TV, and you're speaking to some of the people that were helping with these things. It's amazing. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, let's talk a little bit about books, because we all love books. I know you just posted on Twitter yesterday. You got some new pieces in from collector grade publications.
Gorgeous stack of collector grade books.
Yeah, buddy, I love it. I'm
broke again now, but you know, it's worth it. It's completely worth it. I just wish that, you know, they were more freely available.
Yeah,
you know, if you're paying $100, $200 for one of these books, then you're getting your money's worth, no doubt about it. But I do wish, you know, for everyone out there that can't afford that or can't justify, like I can, investing so heavily in books that are, you know, so expensive.
Right.
I do wish they were, you know, more freely available. You know, I think ebooks are a great thing, but you know, I love having a real book in hand. But I think ebooks are a great way to go. Absolutely. To get some of these publications that are a little less accessible to become, you know, more available to everyone. But I got a great stack of the right next to me.
Nice.
I haven't been through them all yet. That's a pleasure for the weekend, but they came the other day. I love collector grade books, and it was a sad day when Blake Stevens died.
Yeah, I am very glad that they're still selling the stuff, on the primary market, because, we think they're expensive now. Man, it's going to be a terrible day when that stuff's only available on the secondary market.
Some of those editions that are long out of print, they go for so much money, so much money.
Yeah,
eye-watering sums.
Oh God, yeah. And you mentioned ebooks, and I don't own a single ebook, and I don't own a single audiobook. I don't do any of that, but my bookshelves are literally sagging under the weight of the books.
That's the sign of a good bookshelf when it can take it.
Exactly. Although I didn't realize just how much stuff I'd accumulated until we moved earlier this year, and having to pack up
I dread having to move my library, my collection out of its current messy location.
Right.
But I think we're in a good place. Collector grade's still around, thankfully. I don't know whether they're going to be publishing any new books going ahead, but because Blake was obviously the editor.
Sure.
But we have people like Headstamp and Small Arms Reviews publishing arm. They're putting out books that are, there's a few different publishing houses now that are putting out really quality firearms books, and it's an exciting time to be able to research. Not only do we have those resources, but we also have the internet, and we can have the interconnectivity of you and I having a conversation 3,000 miles apart.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really something when you can do that.
Absolutely. And and Headstamp publishing has really come in and filled that void. I think that collector grade, kind of left, and it's proof positive that, even though those books are expensive, people are still hungry for them. I mean, you look at the pre-purchase campaigns for Ian's book and for Jonathan's book. I mean, just substantial sums of money, and they're great, but like you said, still some of that's out of reach for some people, and some people don't necessarily want a book that is, as Jonathan put it when we were talking, something that is going to knock down your mailbox when they try to put it in there. And so there's also a lot of companies that are putting out smaller stuff, that's more easily digestible for the average person who's getting into things, and I think that also gives us a really neat, smooth transition into Osprey Publishing and their weapon series of books that you are very familiar with, having written 2 of them, right? You've got 2 for them? Okay.
Yeah, I wrote the book on the Sterling submachine gun a couple of years ago, and I've just written the book on the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, the PIAT, Britain's Second World War anti-tank weapon. Infantry anti-tank weapon, I should say.
So the PIAT is kind of one of those things that unless you don't know. If that makes any sense.
You could easily mistake it for a bazooka,
right,
or any other kind of shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon of the period.
Right.
But it's kind of unique in that it's not actually a rocket launcher or any other kind of weapon. It's actually a spigot mortar, in that the bomb is fired off of a long steel rod by the force of a propellant cartridge. Kind of weird, but it's what they went with.
Right. Hey, and again, one of those things you going back to our earlier conversation, you don't know unless you try if it's going to work or if it's not.
Yeah. Well, it had a fascinating development history. The idea evolved from the Blacker Bombard, the 29mm spigot mortar, which was a crew-served anti-tank weapon that was developed on the spigot mortar idea. And before that, one of the key inventors, LVS Blacker, had developed a small sort of like section mortar, which went up against a design from Spain that eventually won out, and that became the 2-inch mortar that British infantry platoons used throughout the Second World War. So from that failure, he developed an anti-tank weapon that was viable, and then from that, the PIAT grew from the larger weapon into a weapon that was transportable and wasn't a hindrance in the field like the larger Blacker Bombard was.
what made you choose the Piat?
Well, it's interesting. I was given a list of topics that they were hoping to cover in the future, and I really wanted to write a book on the Browning High Power, because it's a firearm that has always fascinated me. Not only is it essentially Browning's last major design,
right?
It's also a collaborative effort. So Saev helped and finished the design off and evolved it into his own design, essentially. And then not only was it used by the Allies, but it was also used by the Axis during the Second World War. It was produced by both sides. So that's another interesting element to it. So not only was it a captured design that the Germans put into use, but it was also something that was continually produced under German occupation.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to see if I could write a book about the high power, but someone had already snagged that. And I thought, oh, well, never mind. What else is on the list? So I went through the list and I thought, the Piat. Now, no one's written about the Piat before. There's a number of articles about it, and there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding it, because it's an odd weapon. It's a really, really, really kind of sort of an obscure idea to base a weapon on. And it's a bit weird. It's a bit of a weird idea,
It is, yeah.
So I suppose I should try and explain how a spigot mortar actually works for the listener. So basically, the spigot is an iron rod. And in a spigot mortar, it can either be a dynamic spigot or a fixed spigot. So in the Black & Bombard's case, it was a fixed spigot, so the spigot didn't move.
Okay.
So you slid the bomb onto it, and then you pulled the trigger, and a firing pin projected out of the spigot ignited the propellant cartridge, which is in the base of the bomb. And then the propellant gases that expand from that cartridge against the face of the spigot essentially become a gas piston or a gas chamber.
Okay.
And as they expand, the bomb gets projected off it. So that's what fires it. So there's no barrel per se, like a conventional mortar or a conventional firearm. But there is a propellant cartridge, and it's kind of like a flip reverse. The barrel is the rear of the bomb tube itself, and then the spigot becomes sort of like the breech face, so to speak. But the Piat is a dynamic spigot mortar, which means the spigot moves. So it'll move forward into the bomb, and then once it's detonated the bomb and launched it, the recoil forces are soaked up by a giant 90 to 100 pound spring. So that's what makes it shoulder fired. So that's the only reason you can fire a Piat from the shoulder. It's purely because of this giant spring. And one of the misconceptions that grew out of this spring is that that's what fired the bomb.
Okay.
People sort of assumed that it was a spring powered weapon, whereas in reality it was more of a semi-automatic weapon, and the spring was basically the action spring, and also its primary job was to basically soak up the immense recoil of firing a 3.5 inch mortar bomb off the end of a relatively short spigot. A massive amount of recoil is coming back into your shoulder. So in order to balance that out, they had this really significant spring, but it's sort of, that became the basis of a lot of misconceptions. It was spring powered, so it was weak, so it didn't throw the bomb far enough, so it's not accurate. So it was a bit of a joke. Soldiers hated it. All these kind of interesting misconceptions, which when I began researching, some of them they were misconceptions that I held.
Yeah.
So through research, one of the most interesting things was sort of discovering that the misconceptions aren't all true.
Right.
It had decent range. Soldiers actually really liked it. It had applications which anti-tank weapons of the period couldn't dream of. It could fire indirectly as a mortar. So you could drop a bomb indirectly like a mortar round. You could blow a hole in a building's wall, something they call housebreaking, which is one of the more interesting things I read when I read the Piat's actual platoon handling guidance in some of the manuals. It can also be used to break into houses. Like you can blow a wall down, you can blow doors in. that kind of thing. So not only was it, good against panzers, but you could also break up enemy defensive positions and pillboxes and that kind of thing.
Right.
So
it's a lot more versatile than
it was a very versatile weapon, and also it didn't have any backblast like a rocket launcher or, say, a Panzerfaust. So there was no danger of injuring anyone that was stood behind you. So you could use it in close quarters. So there was a lot of interest in aspects of the weapon that came up during my research, and I thought this is actually a really interesting subject, and no one's really done a deep dive.
Right.
So that's why I kind of jumped on it from the list of potential topics that I could have chosen from the series.
Gotcha. Yeah, and the book was great because you're right. It did dispel a lot of the misconceptions that people had. I mean, I'll admit I assumed it was just a giant spring powered weapon.
Yeah.
That's what I thought and was always led to believe. But it is a lot more than that, and it's got some really cool aspects and applications in history that I had only maybe briefly heard about, or some I hadn't even heard about at all.
Its post-war use is really fascinating.
Yes, and that's what I thought was so cool, and I didn't realize any of the post-World War II stuff until I started following along the posts you were making on Twitter, with getting into some of the stuff and its post-war use, and then of course reading in the book about its post-war use. But one thing that I'd like to talk about is its wartime use in April of 1943, when it takes out a Tiger tank, Tiger 131, which I think is really cool. Is actually at the Tank Museum in Bovington.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Basically, it was up against. It was sent forward to take out a Tiger. And that Tiger is now in the Bovington Tank Museum, as you say. And interestingly, through research that was done by the actual museum themselves, they found that the tank had been engaged by a Piat first before it was finally taken out by, I believe it was a field gun, I think.
Okay.
That actually took out in the end. But the Piat had gone up against it and fired 2 rounds. I think 1 miss, 1 hit, but it didn't quite take it out. But it's amazing that was one of the things I really enjoyed when I was researching. I was digging into this, and I thought, wow, these men were going up against Tiger tanks, Panthers.
Yeah.
The most formidable armored vehicles that Germany could put out there, and they were doing it all with this small weapon with a giant spring inside of it that fired a funny looking bomb. And they must have thought, what the hell are we being given here to take out tanks?
Right.
But they grew, a lot of men grew to appreciate the fact that it could take on these vehicles, and it did have a decent amount of armor piercing capability.
Mm-hmm.
The number of medals that were won using the Piat are significant. So I think we have 7 direct actions that involve the Piat that were awarded the Victoria Cross, which is Britain's highest military medal for gallantry, which is basically the equivalent to the Medal of Honor for American listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has dozens and dozens of lesser medals. I mean, I say lesser medals, but it's in order of precedence.
Sure.
So military medals and other gallantry medals, as well as mentions in dispatches, which is sort of like a commendation, where the commanding officer would send a commendation and put it on file. And there are so many that involve the Piat. It's really surprising. And one of the things that I wanted to convey in the book was some of these extraordinary actions that men took, like Ganju Lama, a Gurkha in fighting in Burma in northeast India during the Japanese offensive in 1945. He took on, I believe it was 3 Japanese medium tanks with a Piat, took out 2 of them.
It's crazy.
Badly wounded in the process, and then chased the crews off with hand grenades.
It's amazing.
It's an amazing story. And, the same in Northwest Europe. There were at least 4, more like 5 actually, VC winning actions that involved the Piat directly.
Okay.
So, at the Battle of Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, Major Kane of the parachute, of 1st British Airborne Division, he used the Piat throughout the battle to drive off Stugs and Panzers. It's incredible. There's accounts where men literally chase tanks down the street in order to hit them with Piats.
That's crazy.
It's the level of courage to use the weapon, because obviously it did have a limited range. Its direct fire range was about 100 yards. So, in most cases, it seems that men were getting much, much closer than 100 yards to be sure of hitting their target, which took a huge amount of balls, really.
Oh,
think about it.
Yeah, I mean, tons of courage, like you said, but also tons of confidence in the weapon to be willing, to run forth and do that.
You wouldn't chase a Panzer if you didn't think you were going to hit it, would you?
Right. Exactly. And that's a remarkable amount of gallantry among the men in all the different campaigns there. And it's really cool. And, it played a substantial role in the D-Day campaign and, and
in fact, the very first armored vehicle taken out by Allied infantry was with a Piat.
I learned that in the book.
At Pegasus Bridge, which blew my mind. Honestly, I think we believe some claimed it was a Panzer IV, but a lot of researchers now believe that it was probably a French tank in German service.
Okay.
Because there were a lot of those in service in Normandy at the time, and it was trundling up towards the airborne forces, which had just landed on Pegasus Bridge, and captured it, which was on the extreme flank of the landings. It was right. An important strategic position.
Yeah.
And this tank rolled up, and a sergeant basically waited until it was almost on top of him and fired. And from his accounts, he hated the Piat, and he had very little confidence in it, but they had nothing else. So, he basically, he wasn't assigned the Piat. He just took it up and moved into position, and luckily knocked out this tank, and they managed to hold on to the bridge. But it blew me away when I dug into it, and I found out that probably the very first enemy armored fighting vehicle that was knocked out during D-Day was with a Piat. Amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing. And that's a story that just doesn't get told. And it's so cool that you were able to bring that to light in the book, because I would have never known that story, had it not been for the book. So I'm certainly
one of the things. It's only a short book. It's only basically an overview.
Yes.
I'm hoping to write something a little bit more in depth about it a little bit further down the line. But what I really wanted to do was convey what the men who used it thought about it, and discuss their opinions and thoughts on not only using it in action, but also being shown it, when they were, first issued with these, and, just conveying what they thought about the weapon and whether they thought it was effective. And, there's interesting accounts of officers where after the war, they discussed in interviews with various people, including the Imperial War Museum. One officer discussed the Piat, and he said it was woefully inadequate compared to the weapons that the Germans had, the Panzerfaust, Panzerschreck. And, he's right. He's right. But those are the kind of opinions I wanted to find.
Right.
Because, we can form an opinion from looking at photographs of these weapons, or, watching a video of one being used. But we've never used one in action. It's only these men that have actually experienced what it was like to be sat behind one of these Piats and actually aimed it at a Panzer.
Right. Yeah, it's a perspective that you can only get through their firsthand accounts that comes from a tremendous amount of research put in, by yourself. And that, I think, segues into the next topic is researching in the time of COVID.
Ooh.
Yeah. We talked a little bit
difficult.
It's difficult. Yeah. Short answer, it's difficult. We talked a bit before we hit record about some of the challenges with that. And so I just, on the one hand, we're prevented from access to museums of all kinds and private collections. But we've also got access via the internet to a lot of great digital archives, and a lot of the museums have been really good about putting stuff online. What has been your biggest challenge with researching during COVID?
Well, with the Armourer's Bench, a lot of what we do is we get into collections and we handle firearms and disassemble them and basically get as good a footage and photographs of them as we can to make our basically documentaries and articles. But with the lockdown, I haven't actually managed to get into a single collection this year. I haven't.
Wow.
I haven't been able to get hands-on in any of the collections I was planning to access this year. I mean, we were all hoping to be in Cody again for the symposium, or I believe it was going to be held in Springfield this time around.
Oh, yeah. Yep. In Springfield, Mass. At the Armory.
Yeah. So I was really looking forward to, visiting Springfield Armory and, getting a look at their collection. But COVID just came out of nowhere. And I think it's basically set everyone back and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, not getting access to actual weapons collections is one element of that, and then not being able to access archives too. So I do a lot of archival research at places like the Royal Armouries in Leeds' library and archive.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just no way to get there. We had a national lockdown for 3 months, and then the museum itself didn't reopen until October, and then we're currently in the midst of another month-long national lockdown. So I was hoping to get to the archives, but it just hasn't materialized. And I can't really see it happening this year at this point. Right. But luckily we have resources online, and I know I have a backlog of material that I've photographed over the months and years, and at least I have that to go through and work through. Right. But it's really tough situation for everyone, in the research community.
Yeah.
We just have to ride it out like everyone else, I guess.
Yeah.
These things happen. And while it's an inconvenience, I guess it's a necessary inconvenience. And as long as these institutions continue to be there for, when we can access them again, then that's the main thing. So we have to be vigilant and support institutions that have these collections, have these archives, because it's a tough time for them too,
Absolutely.
A lot of them are laying off staff, and, it's a difficult time because they just aren't getting the visitors. So museums in the UK aren't getting any visitors really because of the lockdowns, and visitor numbers have been down anyway because people are understandably more reluctant to be out in public and, go into places that are going to have large crowds, etc. So
sure.
It's one of those things I think we have to be vigilant of finding ways to support collections, going forward as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. There was an article that came out here stateside a couple months ago that said they were estimating that as many as a third of all museums in the United States might not survive the COVID lockdowns. And of course, I mean, obviously that will entail a lot of, smaller museums and more independently run. We're not talking about like the Smithsonian or the Met or stuff like that, but even those large institutions have suffered tremendously from these shutdowns.
It's the same over here. Like, there's small regimental museums that are self-funded, rely on donations, they're charities in the UK. And it's just they're struggling. They're really struggling. I tried to raise some awareness about this on Twitter, and I did a thread of museums that were doing fundraisers, and I was trying to share as many of those as possible. Mm-hmm. But you know, and it worries. It's a concern for me is that, you know, there's kids that aren't going to get to go to museums, you know, that I got to go to.
Right.
So in the States, like, you know, you can drive through like a fairly small town and they might have a World War II museum.
Right.
Or, you know, an adjunct to like the Veterans of Foreign Wars Association, etc., that kind of thing. They might have a collection, or, you know, they might have something open to the public.
Right.
And it's the same here in the UK. So we have, you know, small privately run museums or small charity run museums. And it is a likelihood that we will see some of them close. And it's really sad.
Yeah, because some of those...
Hopefully most of them survive. I mean, what's the saddest part of that is it's a loss of culture.
Yeah.
You know, and when you lose culture, you lose perspective. And when you lose perspective, then you're less interested in supporting these museums. So it's definitely, you know, something to be, you know, thoughtful and mindful of, that we have to support these institutions while we have them, because it's a lot harder to build something new than it is to, or build back up something than it is to, you know, have something that's going to stand the test of time and survive the pandemic.
Yep. Yeah, and we had issues over here where it actually delayed the opening of new museums. One was the National Museum of Military Vehicles, which is a privately run museum out in Wyoming, but privately run in an unusual way that it's completely self-funded by a guy who's a self-made millionaire. So
right.
But it delayed his opening by a few months because of the lockdowns in Wyoming. But even bigger was the National Museum of the United States Army.
Yeah.
They did not
today,
have. They're opening today. Yeah, we're recording this on November 11th, Veterans Day, Armistice Day. And they were supposed to open, I think, back in June. And their opening got pushed to November. I mean, and that's huge. Now, you know, plus side, they get to open it on Veterans Day, which is, you know, kind of a neat coincidence. But and it gives the staff, you know, an extra 5 months to get the finishing touches on things.
Check all those tags.
Exactly. Yeah. Check all those tags, get rid of the typos and some of the labels that were there. You know, but at the same time, that's also 5 months or so of visitation and gift shop purchases and things of that nature that they're missing out on. And that's, you know, from all the way at the top, like the Smithsonian and the Met, all the way down to your little more independently run museums. And it's having a huge ripple effect for researchers and for visitors and staff and all sorts of stuff. It's been a huge shift. So let's move on. While we're talking museums, you've been fortunate enough to see museums all throughout the world. Part of that comes from the fact that, you know, Europe's certainly a little bit smaller than we are here stateside. So you're able to travel and see more stuff a little more easily than I have been able to here stateside. But having visited, you know, museums over in Europe and museums here in the States, do you have a favorite museum or museum collection that you've enjoyed most?
Wow, that's a tough question. You know, ironically, this year was going to be the year that I was going to foray more into Europe and try and visit some of the collections I haven't actually been to yet. So, like the Dutch Military Museum, and a couple of museums in Germany, and there's a few museums in the Asia as well that I wanted to check out. But yeah, COVID got in the way, and we haven't been able to travel. So, but I have been lucky. You're right. I've been lucky to visit a number of collections and museums that are absolutely amazing, basically. And my two favorites at the moment are the Royal Armouries in Leeds, and the Cody Firearms Museum.
Okay.
So, and that's because not only of the breadth of their collections and the way they actually display their items. I've got fond memories of being a kid and visiting the armories for the very first time the year it opened back in like 1997.
Okay.
So I remember walking around in awe at everything that was on display in the armories. It wasn't until years later when I became a researcher and a historian that I actually got access to the library and the archives and later the National Firearms Collection with Jonathan Ferguson that you've had on previously, and it is the probably the most comprehensive collections that you can imagine. It really is stunning. Mm-hmm. And with the Cody Firearms Museum, I have a great relationship with them because I was a visiting research fellow a couple of years ago. And that enabled me to not only rummage around their archives, but also Danny and Ashley were kind enough to let me, handle firearms in the reserve collection in the back. And actually weapons off display as well. Danny was kind enough to open up some cabinets for me, and that was like a real privilege. And I've always appreciated the lengths that museums will go to to like help researchers access and research elements from their collections. But yeah, so I would say it's a toss up between the Royal Armouries and the Cody Firearms Museum.
Both two very good choices.
Yeah, they're brilliant museums, but there's other great museums too. There's the National Army Museum here in London, in the UK. There's a number of great museums in Germany. Koblenz is a great museum, and my colleague Vic from the Armourer's Bench has recorded a number of videos and had the pleasure of exploring some of the collection of the Dutch military museum, the NMM. Which has a phenomenal collection on par with basically on par with Cody and the armories in Leeds. Mm-hmm. What's your favorite collection though, Logan?
Oh man, what's my favorite collection? That's
collection or museum.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean,
I know you're throwing this out on your guests, but I thought I'd throw it back at you and see what you thought.
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one. I might be a little biased because I worked there for a number of years, but the National Firearms Museum was a joy to work in from a collection standpoint because they had a little bit of everything. They're what I would call lack of a scope of collections was that their scope of collections was everything, and they collected everything. And so it was neat. And I think the biggest benefit to that collection is that there were a lot of pieces in it that were usable arms, so many museum pieces, stuff gets put on display and it sits there. It's a museum artifact. It's preserved for posterity. And, some museums are fortunate enough to have research collections and have pieces that they can do, what's called consumptive use of that. And the NRA museums were very fortunate to have a number of pieces that are able to be used for consumptive use. It was able to shoot a Webley Fosbury and a Mateba and compare the two semi-automatic revolvers and to see how they shoot. So that was really cool. So I really enjoyed that collection just because of, having worked there. So I'm a little biased with it.
No, it sounds like a good choice. That's a collection I would love to look at. Yeah.
Yeah. The next time you're over here, we'll have to certainly make it happen. And the other collection that I really enjoyed is the National Firearms Collection at the Smithsonian in the Museum of American History, because they have tons of patent models, which are just so incredibly cool.
I remember your video on the Browning 1885.
Yeah, and what became the single shot there. And it was so cool. I mean, just they have so many patent models that they're just, you're pulling out drawers and you never know what you're going to find in there. I mean, sitting right next to the Browning patent model was another patent model from Christian Sharps. And then in the drawer just below that was a Lamat patent model, in different variations. It was so cool to go through and see some of those different models. And then, of course, there was all sorts of other weird and wacky stuff in there, too, things that never made it off the ground. And you look at it, you're like, what the heck is that? And I'm looking at the tags and like, I don't recognize that guy's name, and I can't figure out how this action works. So I guess that explains why it never went anywhere.
They're often the most exciting, I think, when you find something in a collection where it's so different from what you're used to that you can't fathom how the actual weapon works itself. Yes. So there's a couple of those that I looked at in Cody. They had a number of pump action patent models that they'd inherited from the Winchester Factory Museum collection, which had been purchased as a result of a lawsuit they were they were defending against. So they were basically protecting against a suit that claimed the claimant had already patented the pump action, which obviously proved, made difficulties for Winchester bringing out the 93 and the subsequent 97. So they went to Europe and found a load of pump action designs that predated the claimant's design and patent that they owned. And basically they came back with these three weird and wacky European designs. One was the Curtis over the shoulder sort of like bullpup pump action. And then there was another English design, and then this bizarre, almost steampunk, although I hate the word steampunk, looking pump action rifle with a helical magazine, which sort of had cool. I think in the end I worked out that it had like a 16 to 20 round magazine capacity, and it dated from 1866, 63. It was early 1860s, and these are the kind of things that you find when you go into a collection that really excite me. Like that's the kind of stuff that's like, wow, now that's interesting, that's rare, that's unusual. This is a weird dead end that someone chased to the point where they actually made a working model, but it never went further. Right. And I think sometimes they're the most interesting firearm stories.
Absolutely. Yeah, you talking about, weird patents that people pursue. It makes me think of, there was a piece that was donated to the National Firearms Museum when I was there. What I assume was supposed to be a rifle of some sort. But it looked more like, oh God, how do I explain it? It had pulleys and strings and wires, and it looked more like it was supposed to be some piece of industrial mechanical equipment than it was ever supposed to be a firearm. But it was, I guess the guy just put it together with whatever he had at hand to accomplish it. And I mean, he did actually get a patent on it. It obviously never went into production, but it was obviously something that he believed in enough that he merited, taking these chunks of steel and welding them together and then adding pulleys and, what was either probably piano wire or guitar wire into the pulleys to make it work. And it just, again, with hindsight, we look at it and go, well, yeah, of course that didn't work. What the hell is this thing? But, that was someone's baby,
It's understandable. I can see why some inventors went down these paths that seemed crazy. I mean, if you look at Browning's first sort of like prototype for the what would become the potato digger, the 1895 machine gun, that's kind of, you look at that and you think that's kind of a weird looking thing. It has that gas trap spoon at the front, and it's right. I think there was an even earlier prototype that was based off of a Winchester lever action as well, just to prove a concept. But sometimes people never really get beyond the proving the concept, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the potato digger is the perfect example of weird looking guns. Because hell, even the production gun is a little weird looking with the lever coming down from the bottom.
At the time, that could have been what everything that could have been the line everything evolved along. Obviously, we went to different gas operated systems, but so many of Browning's other designs were what became the focal point for development from there on. So I can see why some the inventors would create these amazing Heath Robinson looking crazy weapons and think, well, yeah, this is practical. This could become practical.
Same with early semi-automatic pistol designs. You look at some of the Bergmans and all sorts of unusual things. And, then, of course, along comes Browning again with what becomes the 1911. And again, through hindsight, we go, well, yeah, of course it ended up being something like this. But they certainly didn't know when they were working on the designs in the 1890s and the early 1900s as to what exactly was going to work. You look at, just Browning's own designs into what becomes the 1911, even in just the handful of years leading up to it, how much his designs changed, grip angles and safeties and sights and all sorts of stuff.
Various different actions for handguns that fell by the wayside. So there were Browning designs that fell by the wayside. There's two other designs that never went on to become practical. So, and actually, that's another museum that I should mention. That the Browning Museum has a phenomenal collection of his early prototypes. Yeah, it's a great museum, but you can't handle the collection because it's all sealed up in the displays, which is a shame. But it's great that they're on display. I think that's such an important collection that it's possibly overlooked a little, I think.
Yeah. I think so. Well, being in Ogden, Utah.
Lovely town. I went there especially for the museum.
See, but you're weird like that. Yeah. We're weird like that. We would go to Ogden just to go to the museum, whereas other people go, well, where you want to go on vacation this year? I think there are very few people who probably say Ogden. So I don't know what their visitation is like, but
I don't know. It's kind of combined into a museum with trains and automobiles and art. So there's like 4 museums in the town's old central station, which is a gorgeous building.
Okay. Well, maybe that helps bring, helps bring in some of the tourists. Great museum. Much like, much like the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, you may get people coming in, who want to see more of the natural history side, but then the Cody Firearms Museum is right across the hall, so they wander into there too. So, multiple birds with one stone. Right. So we had started talking about this a little out of order, and as we wrap up, we're gonna cover this because I gotta ask it, and you're not allowed to say Patrick Ferguson, or maybe you are. I don't know. You certainly could, but if you could meet any gun designer, living or dead, who would it be?
I think, as other guests have said, that's a immeasurably tough question, and while Ferguson is a great answer, I don't think he would be my go-to. I would love to sit down with him and discuss his theories on light infantry and his development of the screw breech. But there's so many other designers that have been equally, if not more, influential. Like, I would love to sit down with Browning. I think everyone would instantly say, ask anyone that question that's interested in firearms history, and they probably go John Browning. I would very much love to speak to John Browning about his work. That would be, it's a historian's dream, isn't it? Really, getting to sit down with someone like that.
Yeah, it really is.
But there's so many others. There's a whole plethora of designers that we don't really know about. So there's Browning's contemporaries, like. It would be amazing to speak to Andrew Burgess. It would be amazing to get some insight from William Mason. It would, these are Browning's contemporaries who did amazing work and worked in a whole plethora of fields, but their work is sort of forgotten, except for a couple of firearms that might still be in circulation. There's Europeans too.
Right.
Simonov, the Russian designer, that he'd be a fascinating person to speak to. He worked a lot on early Russian self-loading rifles, the SVT 40 and the SKS, and a whole host of assault rifles and pistols as well. I would love to have met Stefan Janssen, the designer of the EM2. So I wrote my master's on the EM2 and the program that he was part of to develop a new infantry rifle for the British Army. And he was a World War II emigre. He was a Polish army officer who escaped from Europe and joined the British Army's armament design department, and worked heavily on a various number of different projects, and then that culminated with the EM2, the bullpup. And where did he end up after the EM2 was rejected? He went to work for Winchester in the US, and worked on early salvo rifle designs. Fascinating character, just for his escape from Europe, as the war began, and the experience of developing such a revolutionary, interesting firearm as the EM2. But I think one firearm that has sort of been central to a lot of the research that I've done, and has always been in the back of my mind recently, is a design by Winchester designer Frank Burton, and he was responsible, we believe, for what is known as the Burton machine rifle, and Burton is accredited with this, but we don't actually know for sure, because we have an example of the rifle which is in the Cody Firearms Museum. We have possibly one or two patents that link to not the weapon itself, but the loading of the weapon's magazines. So basically a magazine loader. But for anyone who hasn't seen the Burton machine rifle, it is a weapon that was designed, and we think about 1916-17 during the First World War. And it has two top-mounted magazines that come off in a V shape from the receiver. One magazine is basically loading the action, while the other one sits in reserve, and then you can swap them over. So it's kind of like a very convoluted sort of like jungle mag situation, where they're actually sat on the gun. For the longest time, people believed that it was described as the balloon buster. So that people thought it had been designed to fire like an incendiary round at observation balloons on the Western Front. But by the time it was ready, there were I believe it was 11 millimeter heavy machine guns that were firing rounds that were capable of setting these balloons on fire far better than the round that the Burton was chambered in. The most fascinating thing about the Burton machine rifle is that it's chambered in what could be described as an intermediate caliber, and it's also ambidextrous. So it's ambidextrous in that the charging handle is at the bottom of the receiver, and it ejects from below as well. But we know so little about the rifle, and we have a tangential link to it being a development of Burton's. So I think he's definitely one of the designers that I would love to sit down and grill. I would love to find out whether he developed that rifle and what it was for. Was it for balloon busting, or was it designed as an infantry weapon? Or, because for that period, that weapon is revolutionary. It is a weapon that looks so unlike anything else of the period. Its capabilities would have been far beyond anything else that was in the field at that time. I suppose the nearest comparison would be the Fedorov in Russia, firing an intermediate cartridge, being select fire. It's just one of those intriguing, mysterious firearms that we haven't quite gotten to the bottom of yet. Danny, Michael, and I at the Cody Firearms Museum, we tried to take it apart, and we got it partially apart, but we couldn't get the working parts out of it. We took the butt off.
Oh, really?
And we couldn't remove what appeared to be a buffer assembly. So we never quite got to grips with how it actually works internally. So again, it's one of those mystery weapons that you go into collections and you look at and you go, how does that work? Who designed this? What is the story behind this? And I did so much archival digging. I dug through dozens of boxes looking for any mention of this. And I've had colleagues at the US National Archives that have dug through Army reports because it was reputedly tested at some point, but we've never been able to find any of the reports or even documentation that actually mentions the weapon. So, yeah, wow. I think Frank Burton would be a great character to sit down with, and he's my choice purely because he's not one that everyone would think of instantly, but he did some fascinating work,
right?
And he was instrumental at not only making sure that the firearms that Winchester was producing during World War I were produced to the correct, timescales and standards, and effectively, but he also helped Browning with the BAR as well.
Yeah. Frank Burton would be a cool one to meet, if for no other reason than to grab him by the shoulders, shake him, and tell him to keep better documentation.
Where are your letters? Why did you not patent your gun, Frank? What is going on?
Right. I'd like to meet his father.
Yeah, you've done a lot of work looking at the stuff his ancestors did.
Yeah, I've done quite a bit on him, and he's fascinating. I think James Henry Burton's just so cool, working for multiple different countries and multiple different companies and designs and all sorts of stuff. And the Burton family would definitely be a cool one. Well, I'm glad you chose
someone that wasn't
Frank
Patrick
Burton.
Ferguson.
That wasn't Patrick Ferguson. Like I said, now I don't have to change the name of the podcast. So that's great. Frank Burton is definitely a good choice. Well, Matthew, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the High Caliber History podcast. It's been great having you here. Wonderful picking your brain about some different things, and looking forward to the Rhineland 45 documentary when it comes out. And, if folks haven't picked up copies of your books on the Sterling and the Piat, they definitely need to. There will be links to those in the description below here as well. Matthew, thank you again. Really appreciate having you.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. There's nothing I like more sitting down with like-minded people discussing firearms history, and all the work that you do through High Caliber is always absolutely fascinating, and it's always great to sit down and talk to you about firearms, Logan. So thank you so much for inviting me on and being in the esteemed company of some of the other guests that you've had on already.
Well, thank you for the kind words. Really appreciate it, Matt. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks again to Matt Moss for coming on the podcast today. If you're interested in learning more about the work he's doing, you can visit him online at historicalfirearms.info and armorersbench.com. And Armourer is spelled with a U because Matt is from the UK. There will be links to these below. I really appreciate you tuning in and listening to this episode, and we'll see you again real soon.